Nail Yakupov was one of the most hyped up prospects throughout the entire 2010s, and the many comparisons he was getting seems almost bizarre as of today. Nail throughout his draft year had all sorts of names being thrown on him, names that varied from Alexander Ovechkin all the way to Ilya Kovalchuk, and even while being drafted, he got compared to Alexander Mogilny live on air. But when going over what Yakupov could bring to the table, Bob McKenzie would bring up a comparison made by Hockey Hall of Famer Igor Larionov, stating,
Igor Larionov went to the history books a little bit and said, you know what, he reminds me very much of Valery Harlamov.
Whoa. Now, I'm sure a lot of you probably don't know who Harlamov is, and I wouldn't blame you, as Valery Harlamov is often referred to as the best Russian player to never play in the NHL. Harlamov was an absolute unit overseas with CSKA Moscow throughout the 60s and 70s. His speed and hockey IQ was off the charts, allowing him to dominate under the international spotlight. Harlamov would win 8 gold medals for the Soviet Union and will be inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 2005. So yeah, no pressure, Yakupov. How would he live up to such high expectations? Well, by becoming one of the biggest draft busts in the history of the NHL. Great job, Nail. Yakupov would start his career off looking relatively strong, but as the years went on, he continued to digress. He barely tried to change certain aspects of his game that were lacking and just couldn't live up to first overall pick standards. A little while back, I was watching Mike Korzemba showcase the NBA's worst draft predictions of all time and wondered, what were some of the worst NHL draft predictions ever made? So, for an entire day, I dug all throughout YouTube to try and find as many full-length draft videos as I possibly could, and I was able to go as far back as the 1990 draft. I picked out some of my absolute favorites and will be sharing them all with you. While we're on the topic of Nail Yakupov, another player, 2 years later, would actually get compared to the former first overall pick. I would prove the scouts completely wrong. That player was David Pastrnak. We all think of David Pastrnak as one of the NHL's brightest stars as of today, as he showcased his premier offensive abilities and goal-scoring prowess, establishing himself, arguably, as the best player on the Bruins roster. David's gotten better every season, already having a Rocket Richard to his name at the age of 25. So why would any scout even think to compare him to the likes of Nail Yakupov? Well, at the time of the 2014 draft, Pastrnak was already one of the draft's most intriguing players. Many scouts were conflicted. Some had them in their top 10, while others saw him as a late first round pick. Regardless, most agreed that David had the potential to become an absolute steal if all panned out. With Pastrnak still on the board come the 25th pick, the Boston Bruins would take the gamble, and even while being drafted, some analysts still had their doubts, with Bob McKenzie stating that he liked the pick but believed that Jakub Vrana had a higher ceiling than he did. Now, Vrana's a great player and a great top 6 option, but not nearly as good as David Pastrnak. By his 3rd year in the league, Pasta would be producing 70 to 80 points, while Vrana was in the 40 to 50 range. And as of now, Pasta is still a lethal offensive threat and has become one of the most entertaining players to watch, often being referred to as the biggest steal of the entire draft. Every year, teams enter the draft hoping to acquire their next face of the franchise, players who will be talked about for years to come. And for this prediction, we need to head to 2012. This involves the Calgary Flames, and as a Flames fan, I feel this quote has gone overlooked throughout the online community, and thankfully so. For those who didn't know, Calgary originally possessed the 14th pick, but would trade that pick to Buffalo to move 7 spots down to the 21st pick, and apparently, there was a pretty good reason to do so, at least to then Flames general manager Jay Feaster, that is. Feaster would move down to select centerman Mark Jankowski, and when being asked about why he made the decision to move back, Feaster stated it was because, quote,
"Yeah, I'll tell you what, John Weisbrod, our assistant general manager for player personnel, John went to see Mark play, and he phoned me. He actually drove through a blizzard to see him play. He was upset with Todd Button, our chief scout. He called me, he said, don't trade the pick. He said, I've just seen the guy who's going to be 10 years from now, he's going to be talked about as the best player in this draft.
Now, this could either go one of two ways. In 10 years, either Feaster would look like an absolute genius, or this quote would haunt Jankowski for his entire career. And as of now, this prediction looks rough. Jankowski was scouted as an elite two-way forward with good size who could make others around him better. The only thing factual about those reports is his size. As from a personal experience and from watching him for the last few seasons, I can confidently say that Mark Jankowski didn't meet those expectations at all. What was upsetting was that he actually looked really good when being called up in 2017, but after a promising 32-point season a year later, Mark went from looking like a full-time NHLer to someone who looked like they were going public skating. During his final season as a Flame, Jankowski's constant turnovers made him a defensive liability, eventually making those around him struggle rather than succeed. I might be a bit harsh on Jankowski, but I and many others had such high hopes for him, and he just didn't pan out. I mean, hell, former Flames general manager Craig Button compared him to John LeClaire, but Button's almost never right, so unlike Mark, the next two players we'll be talking about prove the analysts completely wrong, making them eat every single word.
Today, the Montreal Canadiens are proud to select from the WHL Tri-City Americans goaltender Carey Price.
You think about it now. Jose Theodore, Cristobal Huet, they traded Matthew Ganon. They have Jan Donis, who they signed as an unrestricted free agent coming out of Brown University. This is not a fit for Montreal. They have so many other needs.
This might just be one of the worst takes Pierre Maguire ever made. Carey Price, as we all know, would blossom into a franchise goaltender for Montreal, recently taking them to a Stanley Cup final in 2021. But what I really want to focus on here are the names Pierre mentioned that were better options than Carey, ones who were already in the system, thus making this pick supposedly bad. First, he mentioned Jose Theodore, which was understandable. Theodore would take home the Hart and Vezina trophies in the 01-02 season and was the obvious choice in net, but after the 2005 draft, Theodore would only last one more season in Montreal, where he began to slowly fall off, rejuvenating his career in Washington years later. Pierre also mentioned Cristobal Huet. Huet was a solid backup option, but he too wouldn't last very long, getting traded from the Habs during the 2007-2008 season, where, funny enough, Carey Price would take over. Price was scouted as an athletic goaltender with elite vision and great reflexes, even being ranked as the #1 North American goaltender in the entire draft. Pierre wanted them to take center Gilbert Brûlé, as Montreal lacked depth down the middle, but they ended up making the right move, going with the best available, and it truly paid off. In just his rookie season, Price was putting up winning numbers, and as his career progressed, he would be the backbone of a franchise who relied on him night in and night out, making the team around him more competitive every time he laced up the skates. Price would have a monster 2015 season, taking home a Vezina, Jennings, Lindsay, and Hart trophy, cementing himself as the best goaltender in the NHL. And despite his numerous injuries throughout his career, Price was still able to be at the top of the league whenever he was on the ice. So, not a bad fit for Montreal. For the second player, let's go back to 2003, as this time, it was Bob McKenzie who made the foolish prediction. The Anaheim Mighty Ducks possessed 2 first-round draft picks that year. They would use one on scoring winger Corey Perry, and the other on two-way centerman Ryan Getzlaf. And McKenzie had some interesting things to say about Getzlaf.
He's not a premier offensive player, he's not a premier defensive player, so he's a little bit of a tweener. This guy's got all sorts of potential to be a strong two-way forward, if not a #2 center in the National Hockey League, certainly a #3 that can put some points on the board.
Almost right away, Getzlaf and the Ducks proved McKenzie wrong. In just his second year in the league, Getzlaf, alongside of Perry and Dustin Penner, would form the dynamic kid line, which became the top scoring unit throughout the entire 2007 playoffs. Getzlaf would be the leader in points, helping his Ducks hoist a Stanley Cup at just 22 years old. Soon after, Getzlaf would turn into a top 6 power forward, being praised praised for his all-around game. He would later play the role of a first-line center, where he would lead the Ducks in assists for 10 consecutive seasons, breaking numerous franchise records and becoming one of the greatest players to ever wear the Ducks sweater. Getzlaf's leadership, mixed with his playmaking abilities, made him a valuable asset for many years, and his competitiveness would help his Ducks make several deep playoff runs throughout the 2010s. His consistent 70 to 80 point seasons blew McKenzie's projected numbers out of the water, helping him become one of the best players from the 2003 draft, and an overall steal for the Mighty Ducks. All these predictions have been horrendous thus far, but there's one that I believe truly takes the cake.
A look at history can provide a clue. The French factor is an impressive legacy. And now it's 1993, the next in the generation of French-Canadian stars. Alexandre Daigle.
Alexandre Daigle, as just mentioned, was supposed to become the next French-Canadian great to leave a mark on the NHL. And much like most first overall picks, the comparisons began steamrolling in. With all the players in today's video, we saw that they were compared to just one player, with the exception of Yakupov. But Daigle's comparisons were some of the worst I think I've ever read up on. While reading a Sportsnet article about the biggest draft bust in NHL history, I saw something that literally blew my mind, as apparently Daigle was compared to the likes of, quote, Pat LaFontaine, Joe Sakic, Steve Yzerman, and the Rocket Richard. Are you kidding me? Not to mention, a team was literally accused of tanking to obtain Daigle, so this dude was massively hyped up. The team that was tanking ended up being the Ottawa Senators, who, ironically enough, secured the #1 pick, taking Daigle with high expectations. He was supposedly a fast, agile player who had great playmaking instincts, so all eyes were on Daigle when he arrived on the scene. He would surprisingly deliver during his rookie season, producing 20 goals and 51 points, but after that season was up, he would only reach the 20 goal mark 2 times and would bounce around the NHL and AHL before leaving for the Swiss A-League come 2006. The problem with Daigle's game was that he lacked the motivation, and the fame sorta got to his head, making him seem sluggish at times. Also, the fact that he was supposed to become a generational talent may have been too much pressure for him to handle. Daigle is quoted as stating, "I'm glad I was #1 as no one remembers #2. Daigle will always be remembered, just for the wrong reasons." But #2 in that year's draft happened to be defenseman Chris Pronger, who, unlike Daigle, will forever go down in history as one of the toughest and greatest players of his time.